Okay, settle in. Let's just kick back for a moment and think about something kind of fundamental to our modern pop culture landscape.
Right.
When did Dungeons and Dragons truly capture the imagination? I mean, when did it spark that whole tabletop revolution? It feels like it's just, well, always been a part of things.
Yeah, it really does feel that way, doesn't it? Like it's part of the furniture.
And it had to start somewhere, right?
It absolutely did. And it definitely wasn't an overnight thing. It feels like it's been around forever, woven into the fabric of fantasy and gaming. But its origin story and how it changed over time, that's actually pretty fascinating.
And that's exactly what we're doing a deep dive into today. We're tracing that fascinating timeline, the evolution of D&D, exploring how it changed through its various editions across the decades.
Yeah, looking at all those shifts. And our guide for this journey is a really insightful piece from LitRPG Reads. It's an article titled, When Did D&D Come Out? Timeline of D&D Editions History by Paul Bello.
Paul Bello, yeah. He lays out the major milestones in a really clear, easy-to-follow way.
He really does. It's a great breakdown.
Yeah, it's a great roadmap. So our mission here is, well, to unpack that source, walk you through those key moments and the big changes. We want to see how the gameplay evolved,
And how the community grew and adapted with each version.
Exactly. And highlight what makes each edition kind of its own unique chapter in this whole ongoing story. It's a chance to appreciate the history of something that's brought so much creativity and, frankly, connection to the world.
It's like looking at different layers of history, isn't it? The layers that built the game we know today.
Yeah.
Each version reflects not just changes in the rules, but changes in what players wanted and even what was going on in the world around it.
Exactly. So grab your favorite dice, settle back in your most comfortable chair, because this is going to be a chill, insightful exploration of how a game of dice, paper, and just pure imagination became this colossal cultural force.
Mm-hmm. So to really get it, to understand where D&D came from, we have to step back. Like even before the dice started rolling properly, back to the early 1970s.
Right, before 1974.
Yeah. And Paul Bello's article really emphasizes this. The game didn't just appear out of nowhere in a vacuum. The ground had already been kind of prepared by other types of games.
Right, it wasn't the first tabletop game, definitely not the first game with miniatures or, strategy.
Precisely. The article points out that D&D emerged from like a confluence of influences. It was pulling ideas from different places and sort of blending them together.
Okay.
And the most significant of those influences, the one that really provided the mechanical foundation, that was wargaming.
Wargaming, you mean like little soldiers on a table moving them around?
Exactly that.
Right.
Tactical games often played with miniature armies on a map or some kind of simulated battlefield. These games had, detailed rules for movement, line of sight, weapon ranges, pretty complex combat resolution sometimes.
Right, simulating historical battles or maybe fantasy ones?
Yeah, both. You were essentially simulating battles.
So the whole idea of structured combat
Yeah.
with dice rolls and measuring movement and all that came directly from simulating battles.
That's the root, according to the article. Yeah. It specifically highlights rules written by a guy named Jeff Perrin for a game called Siege of Bodenberg.
Jeff Perrin. Okay.
Perrin's work on combat rules in that game is cited as a direct predecessor to the combat mechanics that would show up in early D&D.
So the building blocks were already there.
Exactly. It shows that these building blocks for figuring out conflict on a tabletop were already pretty well established.
Okay. So the engine for the fighting, the mechanics, came from military simulations. Makes sense. But where did the fantasy elements come from? The dragons, the spells, the dungeons themselves?
Right. That's where the other major influence steps in. Early and mid-20th century fantasy literature. The article is super clear that D&D owes a massive debt to these written worlds.
Okay, so naturally you're thinking Tolkien, Conan the Barbarian, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. The article explicitly points to clear allusions to The Lord of the Rings and the Conan stories by Robert E. Howard.
Yeah, you can really see that.
Oh, yeah. In fact, it even mentions that some of these early borrowings were so direct, so unsubtle.
Like really obvious.
Yeah, that there were actually threats of legal action.
No way, seriously.
Seriously. Which really underlines how foundational those specific literary worlds were to the game's initial concept, character archetypes, monsters, settings.
Wow, that's bold. Just straight up borrowing from the masters back then.
They weren't shy about their inspirations, that's for sure. And it wasn't just the epic high fantasy of Tolkien either. The article also acknowledges a significant influence from sword and sorcery films and the pulp novels of the era.
Okay. So less saving the world, more gritty adventure.
Exactly. Think less about saving the world from ultimate evil and more about gritty heroes fighting monsters, exploring dark ruins, seeking treasure, or just trying to survive. That blend of epic fantasy and pulp adventure is really evident in the earliest forms of D&D.
So you've got the tactical mechanics from wargaming, mixed with the creatures, heroes, and settings from fantasy literature. How did those two streams actually combine to form D&D itself? What was the bridge?
The immediate precursor, the game that really bridged that gap, was Chainmail.
Chainmail, okay.
This was a set of rules co-created by Gary Gygax, a name pretty much synonymous with D&D, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And that same Jeff Perrin we mentioned earlier.
Ah, okay, so the key figures are already working together on this predecessor game.
Yes. Chainmail started purely as a set of rules for medieval wargaming. You'd line up your miniature armies, fight battles, standard stuff for the time.
Right.
But crucially, the article states that D&D began its life as a variant of Chainmail.
A variant, like
Yeah.
a specific rule modification inside Chainmail.
Essentially, yeah. One section of Chainmail included optional rules for fantasy creatures and, importantly, individual heroes fighting on the battlefield alongside armies.
Okay, so not just armies, but individual figures too.
Right, and D&D basically took that idea and ran with it, expanded on it dramatically. It shifted the focus from armies clashing to individual characters venturing into dangerous places, like dungeons.
Applying those wargaming combat rules to smaller fights.
Exactly, applying those rules to smaller scale encounters, exploring a dungeon, facing a single monster, that kind of thing.
So the initial focus, even in those very early D&D stages, was still very much rooted in resolving combat with miniatures, just at a character level rather than an army level.
Pretty much, that was the core mechanic they started with.
But the core seed of exploring fantasy worlds with individual characters, that was the key difference.
Exactly, it was the crucial step. Moving from mass combat simulation to individual adventure role-playing, built upon that foundation of wargame mechanics, and populated with all the creatures and tropes from fantasy literature.
And from those combined roots, the very first D&D game finally emerged.
Which brings us neatly to the original D&D box set, released in 1974.
1974, the official birth year. Wow. What was that initial release actually like? Was it, the polished, thick rule books we might expect today?
Not quite.
Yeah.
The description in Paul's article paints a picture that's probably quite different from modern expectations. It says that by contemporary standards, the original boxed set was, and I quote, amateurish and almost needlessly convoluted.
Amateurish and convoluted. Ouch. That doesn't exactly sound like the slick debut of a cultural phenomenon.
Well, most revolutions start a bit rough around the edges, right?
Fair point, fair point. So what was it physically?
The physical product was incredibly basic, just a collection of 3 small, saddle-stitched pamphlets, like little booklets.
Just 3 pamphlets, no sturdy box, no fancy art.
Nope. No sturdy box with elaborate cover art, no multiple glossy rule books, just 3 little booklets bundled together. Maybe in a plain box, maybe just the pamphlets.
Wow, 3 pamphlets. Okay. And who was actually buying this thing back in 1974? Was it immediately hitting the mainstream?
Oh, not at all. The article makes it really clear that the game made a key assumption right out of the gate. It assumed that anyone picking it up was already familiar with miniature wargaming.
Ah, because it was a chainmail variant. It built on existing knowledge from that scene.
Exactly. It wasn't designed for a total newcomer to tabletop rules and dice mechanics.
Yeah.
So the early market was really niche. It was primarily sold to college students, mostly.
College kids already into wargaming.
Yeah, many of whom were already involved in wargaming societies or clubs, people who understood things like initiative, movement rates, combat tables, that kind of stuff.
Okay, so a small specific audience. And how were sales initially? Did it take off quickly even within that niche?
The article describes the start as not spectacular. Sales were pretty slow. In the first 2 years, they sold about 4,000 copies.
4,000 copies in 2 years. Wow, that's incredibly modest compared to where it ended up. How did it even survive and grow from that point?
Well, even with that slow start, the game clearly resonated with that core group. It struck a chord. By 1975, just a year after release, it was already showing signs of gaining some traction.
Okay.
The article mentions they released supplementary settings relatively early on, like Greyhawk and Blackmoor. These gave players new worlds, new places to adventure.
Expanding the possibilities.
Exactly. And they went back to the printers multiple times, for minor updates to the existing pamphlets. So there was clearly a small but dedicated and growing audience providing feedback and wanting more.
Okay, so the core group was building momentum, sticking with it. What was the pivotal moment then? What helped it break out of that wargaming niche?
That came in 1977 with the release of the D&D Basic set.
The basic set. Right. How is that different from the original 3 pamphlets?
This was a very deliberate effort, according to the article. The purpose of the Basic set was to clean up the rules and make the game a little more suitable for the general public.
Ah, so making it more accessible.
Exactly. The original is dense, assumed prior knowledge. The Basic set was designed to be an actual entry point for people who weren't already wargamers.
And did that strategy work? Did it bring in new people?
Oh, it was incredibly effective. The article calls this version the one that would actually become a legitimate hit in the gaming world.
A legitimate hit. Okay, so that's the moment it started to really become a cultural force, moving beyond the initial niche.
Feels like it, yeah.
What was the secret to its success beyond just cleaner rules? What made it a hit?
The article highlights one massive factor: the packaging.
The packaging. Seriously, like the box it came in?
Yes, precisely. Unlike the loose pamphlets of the original, the Basic set came in a proper box, often that iconic red one.
Okay.
And because it came in a box, it could be stocked in toy stores.
No. That's a huge leap, isn't it? They moved it from like niche hobby shops or maybe mail order into places where everyday kids and families might actually see it on the shelves next to Monopoly or action figures?
Absolutely. This dramatically expanded its reach. It helped spread the game to younger players who might not have access to a specialized game store, and to people who were completely new to any kind of tabletop gaming.
That makes so much sense. You see that iconic box, maybe the one with the dragon, on a store shelf, and your curiosity is immediately piqued. What's this?
Exactly. And the article points out that this version, the Basic set, is often what people today remember or picture when they think of original D&D or Redbox D&D.
Yeah, I think that's true for a lot of people.
It effectively became the new original in the public consciousness, aligning perfectly with the publisher's goal of creating more accessible product.
And the original 1974 pamphlet set, that just became kind of a historical artifact.
Pretty much. A collector's item worth some money today, as the article mentions.
Right. So this early success with the Basic set, selling in box form, getting into toy stores, that led to a significant strategic decision by TSR, the publisher at the time.
Yeah, it did. Looking at the growing, but maybe slightly different groups of players, the newcomers finding it via the Basic set, and the more dedicated wargamer types from the original TSR, decided on what the article terms a two-pronged strategy.
Two prongs?
Yeah, starting in the late 1970s and really into the early 1980s.
Okay, so what does that mean? They split the game into 2 different paths.
Yes. They essentially divided the Dungeons & Dragons property into 2 distinct parallel editions. Ostensibly, they were targeted at 2 separate audiences.
Interesting.
Though, as the article notes, this actually created a bit of confusion at the time about which version was the real sequel to the original game.
Yeah.
People weren't always sure which one to follow.
So they weren't just phasing out the old version and introducing a new one like we often see today. They were trying to run 2 games simultaneously for different types of players.
That was the strategy, yeah. Both Basic D&D and Advanced D&D AD&D were positioned as successors, but they were designed with specific demographics from that original and now growing fan base in mind. The article even suggests looking at the differences in content, like comparing the Dungeon Master's guides for each line, as a good way to see this intended split in action.
Okay, let's look at Basic D&D first in this new structure. How did that version continue to evolve? Did it just stay the intro game?
Basic D&D was positioned as the continuation of the lineage of the original game. Yeah. Maintaining that introductory, accessible feel. It was aimed at players who, in the words of the article, preferred an overall lighter tone and were maybe more comfortable with a bit of improvisation when it came to rules.
So maybe more focused on spontaneous storytelling, less on strictly following every single rule.
That seems to be the implication, yeah. It continued to be sold primarily in box sets, like the famous Red Box, reinforcing its identity as that easy entry point.
Okay.
He was often perceived as the game for novice players, and is still widely remembered as Red Box D&D, really fulfilling its publisher's goal as the gateway game for the masses.
And what about Advanced D&D, AD&D? I mean, the name itself already sounds like it's for the more dedicated player.
It absolutely was positioned that way. If Basic D&D was the accessible introduction, AD&D was explicitly meant for the hardcore crowd.
Ah, the players who wanted more crunch, more detail, more rules.
Exactly. AD&D took the original rules and significantly evolved them. They became much more complex, offering deeper systems, more options, allowing players to do more within the framework of the rules themselves.
Okay.
The article describes AD&D as the version that started down the path to become the modern game, even calling it the true D&D 2.0 in terms of its mechanical trajectory and influence.
So AD&D is where the lineage of increasing complexity and, well, modern D&D really begins.
That's where the foundation was laid for that style of play. It also established a distribution model that basically became standard for the entire tabletop RPG industry.
Oh, how so?
Instead of relying solely on those box sets like Basic D&D, AD&D pioneered the practice of releasing core rulebooks. You know, the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Monster Manual, sold as individual hardcover books.
Right, the classic 3 core books.
Exactly. And these were typically sold in dedicated gaming stores, not necessarily toy stores.
So the thick books we kind of associate with RPGs today, that model started with AD&D.
Precisely. This model of core books plus, endless supplemental releases became the norm, setting a standard that pretty much every other tabletop role-playing game followed for decades.
So AD&D targeted the hardcore with complex rules and individual books, while basic D&D targeted novices with simpler rules in boxed sets. Was AD&D immediately the more popular one then?
Well, the article finds it hard to say if it was as popular as D&D Basic at the time, largely because Basic had that broader reach through toy stores.
Right, accessibility versus depth.
Yeah. But it concludes that AD&D is the version that has tended to endure in terms of its mechanical legacy and its influence on all the subsequent editions we've seen. It set the pattern.
That makes sense. One was the widespread entry point, capturing broad interest, while the other was the foundation for deeper play and future mechanical development. Okay, so as the game grew more visible through this two-pronged approach, it also encountered some unexpected external resistance, didn't it?
It certainly did, yeah. Despite its growing financial success and expanding audience, D&D suddenly found itself facing some pretty significant external threats, which really came to a head around 1982.
And this is where the infamous Satanic Panic comes into the picture.
Exactly. The article places the reaction to D&D firmly within the context of the broader Satanic Panic of that era. This was a period characterized by widespread fear, often fueled by sensationalized media reports, revolving around supposed satanic cult activity and ritual abuse.
A really strange time.
Yeah, the article even mentions the phenomenon of repressed memories, where people came forward with these often bizarre accounts of cult experiences.
And somehow D&D, a fantasy game, got linked to this wave of fear.
Unfortunately, yes. The article states that D&D was seen by some as just another symptom of the same sort of influences, meaning, occult or potentially harmful demonic forces corrupting society.
Wow. What were the specific accusations leveled against the game? What did critics actually point to in the books?
The article notes that moral guardians, as they were described, pointed to things like supposed occult influences in sexual art found within the game's materials.
Sexual art in early D&D?
Well, maybe some of the artwork was a bit suggestive by the standards of the time, or depicted demons and devils, things that could be interpreted negatively if you were looking for it.
Okay.
They claimed, often quite loudly and publicly, that the game would corrupt children. That was the main fear.
So they were scrutinizing the imagery, the themes of spells, demons, fantasy creatures, and interpreting them through this lens of fear and suspicion, linking fantasy magic to real-world occultism.
That was definitely a major part of it. And this public fear was amplified significantly by a TV movie released in 1982 called Mazes and Monsters.
Ah, yes, the one with a young Tom Hanks, the article mentions. I feel like that movie is sort of a notorious footnote in D&D history.
It absolutely is. The article says this movie brought this panic to the television, exposing the fears surrounding D&D to a much wider mainstream audience who maybe hadn't even heard of the game before.
And what was the plot? How did it portray the game?
The movie's central plot, according to the article, posited that players couldn't understand the difference between reality and the game. It suggested that getting too immersed in D&D could lead to mental breaks or tragic outcomes in the real world, like losing touch with reality.
That's a pretty chilling and, frankly, completely irresponsible portrayal of playing a fantasy game. What was the tangible impact of this movie and the wider panic on D&D itself? Did it hurt them?
Oh, yeah. The article outlines several key impacts. Firstly, and significantly, It helped push D&D out of the toy store.
Which we just established was crucial for the basic set's success and broader reach. That must have been a major blow to that side of the business.
It was a huge blow. It limited its accessibility and shifted where the game could even be found. It also, in the article's words, helped to bring the role-playing hobby underground.
Underground, meaning?
Meaning it became something people might be less open about playing. It pushed communities into private homes, basements, or maybe those dedicated hobby stores that catered specifically to gamers. Less public visibility.
So it made the hobby less public, more insular maybe, hiving it away a bit.
Yes, for a time, certainly. Now here's an interesting paradox the article points out. While the panic was obviously negative, perhaps unintentionally, it also brought the game into the public eye for a brief time.
How so?
Many people, the article suggests, first heard about the game through moral panic.
That's wild. So the controversy itself served as this strange negative form of publicity. People heard about this controversial game, this dangerous game, and maybe became curious because of it.
It certainly increased general awareness, yeah. Even if the initial impression was framed very negatively by the news in that movie.
So while it didn't destroy D&D by any means, the Satanic Panic and media like Mazes and Monsters significantly impacted its public image, its distribution channels, and forced it into more dedicated, sometimes hidden, hobby spaces.
It absolutely shaped the landscape for the game, moving into the next decade, the 90s.
Which brings us to the 1990s. Now, the article characterizes this decade as being very good to the game, despite taking that hit to its public image in the 80s. How did D&D manage to thrive during this period?
Well, the article explains that the two-pronged strategy, remember, the parallel development of basic D&D and AD&D actually continued throughout the 90s.
Still running both lines.
Yep. And during this time, the game really started to take on its final form, meaning something much closer to the complex systems and structures we see in RPGs today. The foundation was really solidifying.
So the mechanics and structure started becoming more recognizable to modern players. Less like the original pamphlets, more like, well, like AD&D.
In many ways, yes, particularly with AD&D. The 90s also saw D&D gaining much wider exposure through other media forms. The article specifically mentions that some of the most beloved video game adaptations of the D&D system were released during this decade.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking classics here, like the Gold Box games from SSI, maybe?
Yeah.
And later followed by massive hits like Baldur's Gate towards the end of the decade.
Exactly. Baldur's Gate, Planescape, Torment, huge games.
Those brought the D&D world, and importantly, its mechanics, to a whole new audience who might not have ever sat at a physical table with dice.
Exactly. That cross-pollination was huge for visibility. The article also notes there were a number of legitimate spin-offs from the game that became popular in their own right.
Like the novels, Dragonlance, Forgotten Realms.
Yeah, novels set in D&D worlds became bestsellers, complementing the core game. This built out the lore tremendously and attracted people who were primarily interested in the stories, maybe drawing them into the game later.
And where were people primarily buying and playing the game itself during the 90s, especially after being pushed out of the mainstream toy stores?
The article really highlights the growing importance of the dedicated game store as a central meeting place and sales area during the 90s.
Yeah.
These became the hubs for the hobby.
Right. They weren't just retail outlets, they were community centers for gamers. Places to meet, play, find groups.
Precisely. And D&D absolutely dominated these spaces.
Yeah.
The sheer volume of supplements being released for AD&D in particular meant D&D came to gain a significant amount of square footage in these stores.
Yeah, I remember seeing those shelves, aisles filled with adventure modules, setting books, monster compendiums. It was impressive, maybe a little overwhelming.
It really was.
Okay, let's quickly look at the two main branches again in the 90s. How did basic D&D fare during this time? Did it survive the panic? Okay.
The article says basic D&D took the biggest hit from the scandals of the 1980s, which makes sense given its connection to the toy store market that dried up. But it still went strong, apparently. It continued to sell its boxed sets, maybe finding its audience through game stores or direct mail, and finding its niche.
So it persisted. Did it stay strictly an intro game throughout the 90s?
Interestingly, no. The article notes that by 1991, this version of D&D, the basic line, had become a game for incredibly powerful characters. It had evolved way beyond its simple introductory roots to support very high-level, almost epic play.
Wow. So the basic game eventually supported incredibly advanced characters. That's a fascinating, almost counterintuitive shift.
It really is. The article mentions that the earlier supplements that enabled this kind of powerful play were eventually collected into this huge comprehensive book called the Rules Cyclopedia.
The Cyclopedia, I've heard of that. It's massive.
Huge. And the article says it really codified the D&D's place in the gaming pantheon by consolidating all those rules for the basic line. It was basically the massive compendium for experienced players of that specific D&D branch.
But did they still try to bring in new players with basic D&D, or was it just for the established high-level players by then?
No, they still tried. The article mentions Basic D&D saw one final boxed set released in the 1990s. This was another introductory set, kind of a last effort to capture new players using that established boxed set model.
Okay, so Basic D&D in the 90s was this weird blend of supporting super high-level play with the massive cyclopedia and still trying to be an entry point with new boxes. What about AD&D during this period? This is AD&D version 2, correct? Second edition.
Yes, AD&D V2, or second edition. The article notes that this version moved the game farther afield from the original version. It wasn't just a minor iteration. It was a significant evolution from first edition AD&D.
How so? What was the focus?
The primary focus was really on evolving the mechanics to make a better game, maybe smoother, more balanced, with, as the article puts it, a bit less attention paid to the tone that was generated by the original, perhaps grittier first edition.
So mechanical refinement and game balance were key priorities for 2E.
That was definitely a priority. And AD&D's second edition also directly addressed the backlash from the Satanic Panic in the 80s. The article explicitly states it took note of the scandals and made some changes to its materials.
Okay. How did they modify the content to respond to those criticisms?
The article notes it involved, well, toning things down quite a bit. AD&D second edition left behind its old sword and sorcery roots to some extent.
Less Conan, more high fantasy.
Maybe, yeah. It embraced a combination of history and mythology more overtly. And crucially, things like sexuality and violence were toned down in the artwork and descriptions. Demons and devils were renamed Tanari and Batizu, things like that.
So a deliberate effort to shed that controversial image from the 80s and present a cleaner, perhaps more respectable, or maybe just less overtly provocative fantasy product.
That seems to be the clear intent behind some of those changes, yeah. But at the same time, while toning down some themes, the game also embraced deeper systems.
Deeper systems.
Right. We saw things like kits, which were like specialized subclasses adding flavor and minor mechanical tweaks, and expanded non-weapon proficiencies, allowing characters to specialize in skills outside of combat, building on that trend that started a bit in late first edition, more customization options.
And this era, AD&D second edition, is known for some really memorable and unique campaign settings too, right?
Absolutely. The article points out that AD&D second edition brought some of D&D's most loved settings to the fore. We're talking about truly imaginative worlds here.
Like
Spelljammer, where you literally sail magical ships through space between planets.
Spelljammer, so cool.
And Ravenloft, the iconic gothic horror setting ruled by the vampire Strahd von Zarovich. Plus, Dark Sun, Planescape, really creative stuff. These settings defined the era for many players.
Yeah, those settings have real legacies. So the 90s were a period of significant mechanical evolution, especially in AD&D 2E, plus those tonal shifts responding to past controversies, and the creation of these rich, diverse settings. Sounds pretty good creatively.
Creatively, it was a very rich period.
But despite all this creative output and the game's popularity within the hobby, the company behind it all, TSR, was facing serious underlying financial issues. That seems odd.
That's a critical point the article makes.
Yeah.
While D&D itself was popular, TSR as a company wasn't in great financial health during the 90s.
This seems surprising, doesn't it? Given the visibility from video games and those packed game store shelves filled with their products, what were the reasons for TSR's struggles?
The article lists several contributing factors. One potential issue mentioned is that two-pronged strategy itself.
Running basic and advanced simultaneously, how was that a problem?
The article suggests it wasn't necessarily bringing in more total players, but might have actually been dividing its own player base. It kind of forced players and stores to choose one system over the other, rather than maybe engaging with a single unified line.
Okay, so instead of doubling their market, they were potentially splitting it and competing with themselves for shelf space and player attention. That's one theory.
That's one interpretation offered. The article also points directly to TSR's heavy reliance on supplements.
Ah, the endless stream of source books we mentioned.
Exactly. While those filled game stores, the article argues it bled dry a player base that only had limited funds. Players felt like they had to buy book after book, new settings, new monster books, new rule expansions, just to keep up or explore different options. The cost added up incredibly quickly.
Yeah, the supplement treadmill. It's great for providing depth, but can absolutely become a financial barrier if you feel like you always need to buy the next shiny book.
Exactly. And then for potential new players looking to get in, especially after Basic D&D was largely pushed out of the easier-to-access toy stores, the sheer complexity and the overwhelming volume of material for AD&D 2E made it hard to figure out where to start.
Right. You walk into a game store, see 50 AD&D books. Where do you even begin?
Precisely. The article says this complexity was actively scaring away new players, just as those easier entry points like the basic set were becoming less available in mainstream retail.
So existing players were facing supplement fatigue and rising costs, while potential new players were intimidated by the wall of complex books. That sounds like a challenging cycle for the company.
It really was. And then the final major factor the article points to, hitting right in the mid-90s, was the explosive rise of the collectible card game phenomenon.
The magic, the gathering effect. The 800-pound gorilla enters the room.
Precisely. The article describes CCGs like Magic as games that were simple, yet required a continuous cash supply.
Simple to learn, hard to master, and always another pack to buy.
Exactly. Unlike buying an RPG book every few months, maybe, CCGs encourage frequent, smaller purchases of booster packs just to stay competitive or collect the cards you wanted. They just gobbled up a huge share of the market, attracting gamers' disposable income like nothing before.
So they were directly competing for that same pool of enthusiast money that TSR needed to survive, and their business model was arguably much more effective at generating consistent high-volume revenue.
Yes, and the article concludes that the combination of internal issues like the divided lines and supplement fatigue, plus the external pressure from CCGs, meant that the financially mismanaged TSR reached the end of its rope.
They just couldn't sustain it anymore, which led to the massive shakeup in ownership that changed everything.
Right. Wizards of the Coast, WOTC, the company that created and utterly dominated the CCG market with Magic, The Gathering purchased the entire D&D property from the struggling TSR in 1997.
Wow. The CCG innovator buying the granddaddy of RPGs? That's a really significant turning point in tabletop gaming history.
Huge.
So Wizards of the Coast takes over D&D in 97. What was their first big move with the property? Did they just keep publishing AD&D 2E?
No, they took some time. After about 3 years of evaluation and development, Wizards of the Coast released their first major, completely new version of the game, Dungeons & Dragons 3rd Edition in the year 2000.
D&D 3rd Edition. Okay. What was the driving philosophy behind this new version? Were they trying to fix the problems of 2E?
The article says WotC's goal was pretty ambitious. They wanted to combine some of the best influences of D&D Basic and AD&D. The idea was to finally unify those two game lines that TSR had kept separate for so long.
One D&D to rule them all, finally.
Kinda, yeah. They also explicitly wanted it to be both more player-friendly and more universally usable.
Player-friendly makes sense, maybe addressing that complexity issue that scared off newcomers in 2E. But universally usable, what does that mean?
That refers to what the article highlights as a really key innovation of 3rd Edition. It was the release platform for the D20 system.
The D20 system, right.
This wasn't just D&D's internal rule set. It was specifically meant to be a universal role-playing system, released under something called the Open Game License, or OGL.
Open license, meaning other companies could use it.
Exactly. The article notes the D20 system could and would be exported to many other franchises. This open licensing allowed other companies to publish their own games, using the core D20 mechanics, things like the basic dice rolling, attack bonuses, saving throws, skill checks, without paying hefty license fees.
Wow, that's a big deal. It created a whole ecosystem of compatible games.
Huge ecosystem. The article also says the easy mechanics helped it to become a major player in its own right, suggesting the D20 system itself, even outside of D&D, became really influential across the industry because it was relatively straightforward and adaptable.
So 3rd Edition was more than just a new version of D&D. It was launching a potential new standard for the entire industry, driven by WOTC. How did this focus on universal mechanics translate into the gameplay for D&D itself? What felt different for players?
The article says 3rd Edition relied heavily on player customization. It really empowered players to build unique, mechanically distinct characters in ways that maybe weren't as easy or codified before.
How did they achieve that? What were the new tools?
Well, this is the edition that introduced feats as a concept.
Feats. Right, those are still a big part of modern D&D.
Exactly. Feats were these special abilities or areas of expertise that a character could choose as they level up, allowing for significant specialization beyond just their base class features. It also increased the reliance of out-of-combat skills, giving non-combat abilities like diplomacy, stealth, climbing, or knowledge checks a much more robust and standardized mechanical backing through a unified skill system.
So your character's background, their skills, their personality could have a real measurable impact on the game beyond just hitting things in combat. Much more structured than before.
Precisely. More structure, more options. Yeah. The article also mentions that players could use various new supplements and articles to create new prestige classes or to customize their base classes.
Prestige classes, what were those?
There were like advanced career paths you could aim for after meeting certain prerequisites, like needing specific skills or feats or belonging to a certain organization. They offered unique abilities and really allowed for deep character specialization. This layered customization meant characters could be incredibly varied and players could really fine-tune their builds.
That sounds like a huge amount of depth for character building. Very different from the simpler origins. The article calls 3rd edition a renaissance for the property. Why such strong praise? What made it feel like a rebirth?
The article argues it brought D&D back into the spotlight and arguably back into the world of modern role-playing. After the financial struggles of TSR and the lingering shadow of the Satanic Panic, 3rd edition with its unified rules, the exciting open D20 system, and focus on customization, felt fresh, powerful, and maybe more accessible compared to the sprawling complexity of late 2E. It felt relevant again in the new millennium gaming landscape.
A clear success then, rejuvenating the brand. But the article notes it wasn't perfect, which led pretty quickly to version 3.5.
Right. Paul's article states that 3rd edition was not, however, a perfect game, mentioning a few glaring issues. Maybe some balance problems or rules that didn't quite work as intended in practice.
Happens with any new system.
For sure.
Yeah.
And this led WOTC to release D&D v.3.5 relatively quickly, just 3 years later in 2003.
3 years isn't a long time between editions. Was this another total reboot like 3rd edition was?
No, the article clarifies that 3.5 was not an entirely new version. Think of it more as a comprehensive update or revised edition. It was a collection of rule changes and expansions, designed to fix the problems in 3.0.
And where did these updates and fixes come from? Player feedback.
Exactly. Many of the changes were taken from supplements or playtesters. WODC was actively listening to feedback from the huge community that had jumped into 3rd edition and incorporating fixes, clarifications, and maybe some popular house rules or concepts that had emerged since the 2000 release.
So it was very much a response to real-world play experience and community input, refining the system based on how people were actually using it.
Exactly. The article notes that while the changes themselves were not radical, it still felt very much like 3rd edition. They reinvigorated the player base and helped to improve playability considerably. It was really about smoothing out those rough edges of 3.0 based on a few years of intense playtesting by the community.
Reinvigorating the player base, mostly by fixing those glaring issues you mentioned. Were they mainly about balance or complexity?
The article doesn't go into super specific rule examples, but yeah, generally, these kinds of mid-edition updates often address things like rules that were consistently confusing players, parts of the game that felt unbalanced, like certain spells being too powerful, or some classes lagging behind others, or maybe incorporating popular mechanics that had been introduced in supplementary books back into the core rules. It was about fine-tuning.
That makes sense. A living game definitely benefits from that kind of iteration and response to feedback. Keeps it healthy.
And 3.5 continued that 3rd edition trend, releasing a series of new rulebooks and supplements, always geared towards offering more player options, maintaining that focus on deep customization. The article also notes the system managed to stay true to the D20 vision, meaning it didn't break compatibility with all those other D20 system games that have sprung up under the OGL. A 3.5 adventure could still largely work with the original 3.0 rules, and vice versa, mostly.
Okay, so what's the overall legacy of D&D 3.5? How is it remembered?
The article states that for many, many players, D&D 3.5 would become the definitive version of the game. That's a strong statement.
Definitive? Wow, why?
It describes it as being finely tuned after the 3.0 fixes. And it says, it put the needs of the most hardcore players first, really rewarding players who love digging deep into the rules, optimizing characters, and exploring all those countless options. It was a system you could really sink your teeth into.
So it was a complex system, but one that heavily appealed to dedicated, invested players who enjoyed that depth.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
While still being, according to the article, fairly friendly to novices, it was easy enough to pick up in a single play session. It seemed to hit a real sweet spot for a large part of the player base, offering incredible depth for veterans while remaining relatively approachable for newcomers compared to, say, the sprawl of AD&D 2e.
That sounds like a real peak moment for that era of D&D, a beloved, refined system. But the decision to eventually move away from 3.5, that caused problems, didn't it? The article mentions it led to a major split in the community.
It absolutely did. The article is very direct about this point. It was the decision to move away from 3.5 that precipitated the biggest split in the D&D community, bigger than any before it.
A split? What actually happened? People just refused to switch.
Well, when Wizards of the Coast announced their plans for a brand new version of D&D after 3.5 had been so successful and beloved, not all of the community were happy. And you can kind of understand why, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you saw 3.5 as the definitive or finely tuned version, the idea of a major overhaul, maybe throwing out rules you loved, would be pretty unwelcome.
Exactly. Players had invested significant time learning the system, money buying all those source books, and real creative energy-building characters and campaigns within that 3.5 framework.
Oh.
They weren't necessarily ready or willing to move on just because WDC said so.
They wanted to keep playing the game they loved.
Precisely. So the article explains that some decided to butt off and continue the innovations they thought were most worth in 3.5. They chose to take the 3.5 rule set, which was available under that open game license, as a foundation and just keep building upon it independently from WDC.
And this is where Pathfinder comes into the story.
Yes. The article identifies Pathfinder, published by a company called Paizo, which was originally making magazines and adventures for D&D 3.5, as the best-known game to iterate out of 3.5.
Pathfinder is huge now. It's a whole major RPG system in its own right, a direct competitor to D&D. How did it relate to D&D 3.5 initially? Was it just a clone?
The article describes Pathfinder as largely influenced by Dungeons & Dragons, obviously, but emphasizes it is very much its own game. It clearly took 3.5 as a starting point and began to create a version of the game that carries much the same legacy for its players. It was often called 3.75 informally at first.
So it aimed to be the continuation of 3.5 that those players wanted. How did Pathfinder improve or change things from the base 3.5 rules?
The article notes that Pathfinder aimed to trim much of the fat from 3.5, suggesting a process of streamlining and refinement. It highlights specific improvements like having fewer dead levels, which means character levels felt more consistently rewarding with new abilities or power boosts, rather than having some levels in 3.5 where you gain very little meaningful progression.
Ah, okay. Making leveling up always feel impactful.
Right. It also aimed for better progression overall, and crucially, a more tightly balanced set of combat rules. Balance was a big focus.
Tightly balanced combat is often a big draw for players who really enjoy optimizing characters and engaging with tactical gameplay. So Pathfinder essentially offered a refined, continuously supported version of the 3.5 experience for those who didn't want to jump to whatever WotTC was planning next.
That's the essence of it, according to the article. It provided a really viable option for many players and creators who loved the 3.5 rule set and wanted to see it continue to evolve and be supported with new content just outside of WotTC's official D&D banner.
So the community split wasn't just players leaving, it led to the creation of a major, lasting competitor built on D&D's own open licensed foundation. That's fascinating. Meanwhile, WotC continued down their own path of innovation with their next official edition.
Right. While Pathfinder was busy establishing itself as a strong alternative based on the 3.5 rules, WotC was looking at the broader gaming landscape in the mid to late 2000s.
And by this point, the competition wasn't just other tabletop RPGs like Pathfinder, was it? The digital world had changed things.
No, not at all. The article makes it clear that D&D was now competing for space against MMORPGs and other faster-paced games. The digital gaming world, especially online multiplayer games, had absolutely exploded in popularity.
Games like World of Warcraft were absolutely massive by then, demanding huge amounts of players' time and attention. D&D had to feel relevant and engaging in that totally different context.
Exactly. The landscape had shifted dramatically, and WotC decided it was time to innovate again, perhaps quite radically, to meet those challenges. This led to the release of Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition in June 2008.
4th edition, right. The article mentions it was released amidst great controversy. That immediately suggests it was a pretty big departure from 3.5, doesn't it?
Oh, it certainly was. The article describes 4th edition not just as an update, but as a truly complete reboot of the game.
Wow. Even more of a fundamental change than 3rd edition was from AD&D 2nd edition?
The implication is definitely that it was a much more fundamental restructuring of the core game mechanics and the underlying philosophy of play. A real break from the past.
Okay. What were the goals behind this major reboot? Why change things so drastically?
The article says they aim to make the game simplified and streamlined for newer audiences, maybe hoping to capture some of that massive online gaming audience. And importantly, they wanted to sped up gameplay significantly.
Speed and simplicity. Okay, that sounds like a direct response to the faster pace and maybe lower barrier to entry of popular digital games at the time.
That seems to be a key driver, yeah. The article notes they also made combat a bit more intuitive and tellingly stated that combat was at the forefront again. The focus really shifted heavily towards tactical encounters.
Back to the wargaming roots, in a way, but maybe with a different flavor?
The article makes that connection, yeah, noting that miniatures became an important part of the game, and in many ways it was moving back to its wargaming roots.
Yeah.
The mechanics were heavily designed around tactical combat on a grid.
How so?
Almost every character ability, every spell, had a defined range, area of effect, push-pull effects. It felt very much like a tactical miniature skirmish game. Character roles like Defender, Striker, Controller, Leader were explicitly defined, almost like MMO roles.
Okay, so a strong emphasis on streamlined, tactical, grid-based combat, maybe drawing inspiration from video games and MMOs. How was this radical shift actually received? The article mentioned controversy.
It was definitely controversial, maybe the most controversial edition release ever. The article states flatly, it was not appreciated by everyone. That's putting it mildly for some corners of the internet back then.
Why the backlash? What did people dislike?
Coming right after the deeply beloved complex and option-rich 3.5, many players felt 4th edition was too streamlined, that it lost too much of the depth and the free-form customization options they cherished. Some felt it played too much like a video game or an MMORPG, stripping away elements they considered core to D&D's identity. Like maybe the non-combat aspects felt less developed.
So the very things that were designed to make it relevant and appealing in the modern gaming landscape were the exact things that alienated some of the existing dedicated player base who liked the older style.
That was certainly a significant part of the backlash, yeah. The change was just too jarring for many who loved 3.5 or even earlier editions. However, the article also points out that WODIAC was forward-thinking in another way with 4th edition. They were actively embracing new technology alongside the game itself.
Okay. How did technology play a role in 4th edition?
The article mentions there were fantastic software tools that could be used to enhance gameplay. This included things like official digital tools, character builders, encounter builders, monster databases, even early virtual tabletop support. They were really trying to integrate the digital convenience people were getting used to in that era.
Tools to help run the game more easily.
Yeah. And it also notes that even just the publishing of the rulebooks in .pdf format would change how players interacted with the material, making the rules instantly accessible and searchable digitally, which was still relatively new for major RPGs back then.
Getting official rulebooks as PDFs was a pretty big step towards digital accessibility for players at the time, for sure.
It absolutely was. So 4th edition was definitely a bold, polarizing move. The article acknowledges it wasn't always well received, but it also notes that it does still have a fairly strong player base. Even years later, it found its audience.
So it found its niche, people who really liked that tactical combat focus and maybe the digital tools, even if it wasn't universally loved, like 3.5 seemed to be.
Yes, exactly. The article concludes that 4th edition really stands as a testament to the changing times and Wizards of the Coast's attempts to keep the game relevant by making significant, if controversial, changes in response to the rapidly evolving gaming world around it.
A bold experiment in adaptation, even if it caused a stir. Okay, so after the controversial combat-focused reboot of 4th edition, what came next? The article titles this section Legacy and Reinvention for 5th edition, which was released in 2014.
Yes, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, launched in 2014, significantly timed to coincide with the 40th anniversary of D&D's original release.
The 40th anniversary, that's a major milestone. Seems like a good time to launch something significant. How does the article describe 5th edition? It notes it's difficult to fully describe even a few years after release. Why difficult?
That line suggests it's maybe a multifaceted edition, one that isn't easily pigeonholed into a single category, like maybe 4E was tactical combat focus or 3.5 customization focus. The article presents two key perspectives on 5th edition's nature, trying to capture its essence.
Okay, interesting. What's the first perspective it offers?
One way to view 5th edition, according to the article, is as an attempt to get D&D back to its roots.
Back to its roots. After the radical changes and MMO styling of 4th edition, that's quite a swing back.
Seems like it, yeah. The article says 5e certainly embraces much of the complexity that was lost in the transition to 4th edition, suggesting it brought back some of the deeper rules feel, maybe more character options, things players missed from earlier editions.
Okay.
It also says it brings back a certain sense of legacy that was lost at the same time, implying maybe a return to the overall feel and structure of earlier editions, perhaps shades of 3.5 or even AD&D, aiming for that traditional D&D experience.
So it aimed to recapture some of that classic D&D feel and maybe some of the complexity after the heavy streamlining of 4E, appealing to lapsed players.
That seems to be a core part of the design vision, yeah. It brought back concepts that felt more traditional, but often streamlined them in new ways, like the advantage system, simplifying all the complex situational modifiers from 3.5. It also re-emphasized the 3 pillars of play: exploration, social interaction, and combat, trying to balance them more evenly rather than having the heavy combat focus of 4E.
Okay, so bringing back legacy but maybe refining it, what's the second perspective the article offers on 5E?
On the other hand, the article also sees 5th edition clearly as another attempt to reinvent D&D adventures for a new generation.
Reinvent for a new generation. Okay,
Yeah.
so it's not just a purely nostalgic throwback to earlier editions.
Exactly. The article backs this up by noting there are, quote, enough mechanical and setting changes to make clear that this isn't a rollback to something earlier. It wasn't just re-releasing 3.5 with a new coat of paint.
How was it reinvented then?
It was clearly designed with modern sensibilities for accessibility and smoother play experience in mind. Character creation was streamlined compared to 3.5. The core rules were presented in what many felt was a clearer, more intuitive way than some older versions, and it introduced elements like backgrounds adding mechanical weight to character history, catering to contemporary players' interest in story and character depth alongside mechanics.
So it tried to perform this tricky balancing act, appealing to longtime fans by returning to some legacy concepts and feel while simultaneously making the game more welcoming, streamlined, and intuitive for brand new players.
That seems to be the tightrope walk 5th edition attempted, yeah. And the article summarizes its nature by calling it just another iteration, but an interesting one, albeit one that feels familiar and different all at once.
Familiar and different. Yeah, that really captures the dual nature it seems to have aimed for. What does the article say about the significance of 5th edition's release back in 2014?
The article sees its release as a positive sign that Wizards of the Coast cares deeply about the property. Releasing a major new edition on the 40th anniversary, undertaking a massive public playtest process, D&D Next, to gather feedback, and actively trying to reconcile different eras of the game. It showed a real commitment to the game's future and trying to unify the player base after the 4E split.
And its popularity. The article was written, maybe a few years after the 2014 release, so it was still assessing its long-term impact at that point.
Yes, exactly. The article states that at the time of writing, the popularity of 5th edition, quote, compared to 3.5 or 4E was yet to be seen. The dust was still settling. Would it reach the widespread embrace that 3.5 eventually achieved? Would the community remain split between 5E, Pathfinder, and maybe even lingering 4E groups? Wasn't clear yet.
That's a fascinating snapshot in time, isn't it? Not knowing just how incredibly successful it would eventually become. Because from our perspective now, looking back, 5th edition is undeniably massively popular, arguably the most successful edition ever in terms of mainstream reach and bringing in new players.
Absolutely. It definitely went on to become a colossal success, fueled partly by things like D&D streaming shows, celebrity players, and just generally becoming much more visible in popular culture than ever before. It really brought huge numbers of new players into the hobby.
Yeah, it really hit the mainstream.
But the article, written slightly earlier in its lifespan, concludes this section simply by stating, "What's important, though, is that the legacy of D&D continues," which is certainly true, regardless of which edition you prefer.
And that brings us right up to the latest information presented in the article, which looks towards the future with something they were calling One D&D back then.
Yes, the concept introduced around 2022, outlining the path forward after 5th edition's long run.
The article says that with this One D&D concept, D&D editions, as traditionally known, will be no more. Whoa! That sounds like a really fundamental shift in how the game evolves and is published.
It really is. Instead of these discrete, numbered editions released every several years, like 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, the system is described as a continually updating One D&D system that was, at the time the article was written, unrolling.
Continually updating, what does that mean in practice? Like ongoing patches or a digital service model for a tabletop game?
That seems to be the model they're moving towards, yeah. The article says, the more complete rules will be continuously updated for players as time passes. Now, we know this evolved into the 2024 Player's Handbook and subsequent core book revisions, which WTC emphasizes are compatible with 5e, but contain significant updates and changes.
Right, so rather than waiting for a completely new D&D 6th edition, maybe 10 years down the line, changes, additions, and refinements happen more frequently, integrated into revised core books and potentially digital tools like D&D Beyond.
That seems to be the direction indicated, yes. A more iterative, ongoing evolution rather than distinct revolutionary breaks between editions. The article offered a brief assessment of this idea, suggesting back then that this approach isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Not necessarily bad. Which kind of implies there might be potential downsides too, perhaps, but the article doesn't really elaborate on them. It just focuses on presenting this as the new path forward.
Right. It's presented simply as the latest evolution in D&D's long history, moving away from the concept of static numbered editions towards a more dynamic, continuously evolving rule set, perhaps more akin to how online games or software are updated over time.
And that brings us pretty much right up to the present moment and where the ongoing journey of D&D stands today with these new 2024 core books rolling out.
It's been quite the ride getting here, hasn't it?
What an incredible path this game has taken. Seriously. From those 3 basic pamphlets for niche wargamers back in 1974.
Yeah, just pamphlets.
Through those strategic splits into Basic and Advanced D&D, facing down moral panics and getting kicked out of toy stores.
Surviving all that somehow.
Navigating TSR's financial turmoil, changing ownership to Wizards of the Coast, launching a universal system with 3rd edition and the OGL.
Which led to that huge community splinter with Pathfinder when they moved on from 3.5.
Right. Then radically rebooting with the controversial 4th edition, finding a new kind of balance and massive success with 5th edition.
And now looking towards this future of continuous updates and revisions with the latest core books, moving away from the traditional edition model, it's constant change.
It's truly remarkable how this core idea, just cooperative storytelling with friends and dice, has managed to adapt and persevere through so many massive changes in the gaming landscape and even in society itself over 50 years.
It really is. Each edition, when you look back like this, really is like a timestamp, isn't it? It shows us what was happening in the world of gaming, what players valued, maybe even what technologies were emerging right when it was created.
It really highlights the resilience and adaptability of that fundamental human desire to just gather together, roll some dice, and collectively imagine fantastic worlds and adventures. That core appeal seems timeless.
And what's consistently fascinating, I think, is seeing how those initial influences we talked about, the wargaming mechanics, the fantasy literature tropes, continue to echo through all the different versions, even as the game completely reinvents its rules and presentation. The DNA is still there.
Absolutely. And we really have to give a big shout out again to LitRPG Reads and Paul Bello for laying out this history so clearly in their article, When Did D&D Come Out? Timeline of D&D Editions History. It provided a fantastic map for our deep dive today.
Definitely. Paul's a fine fellow, really involved in the community in lots of ways. And this historical overview he wrote is just a wonderful contribution for anyone wanting to understand the game's journey.
It made it so much easier to trace that lineage and understand the connections and the breaks between the different eras.
Yeah, it really helped frame the whole story.
So for you, the listener, after hearing this whole timeline of D&D's evolution, what stands out most? Which edition maybe resonates most with your own experiences playing D&D, if you have them?
Or if you're new to the history, maybe which era or edition sounds the most intriguing or surprising based on what we've discussed today. The gritty beginnings, the split, the 3.5 golden age, the 4E experiment, the 5E phenomenon.
Yeah, which one makes you go, huh, I'd like to know more about that one.
And, thinking about this latest shift, the move towards a continuously updating system with the 2024 revisions and beyond, it does raise an interesting question for the future, doesn't it? About the hobby's relationship with its own history.
Oh, how so? What's on your mind?
Well, consider this. With this move towards a continually updating D&D where rules evolve more incrementally rather than being released as these distinct, static numbered editions, how might that sense of distinct editions, remembering playing Redbox D&D or being firmly in the 3.5 era or having started with 5e, how might that sense of defined eras and the powerful nostalgia so many players have tied to them change for future generations?
Ah, that's a really interesting point.
What might be gained, by having a living, constantly refined rule set that's always being tweaked and improved? But also what might be lost when there isn't that clear, bounded edition tied to a specific time in your gaming life to look back on with that specific kind of nostalgia.
That's a great provocative thought. Will players 20 years from now have the same kind of shared memory of my edition when the game is presented as this single, continuously evolving system? It's a totally different way to mark your personal history with the game, isn't it? Less defined milestones.
Exactly. The relationship with the rule set itself potentially becomes less about mastering a fixed historical artifact, like learning second edition, and maybe more about engaging with a dynamic, ongoing process of updates and changes. It's a different feel.
It really makes you think about how we'll define and remember the game's long and tangled history moving forward into this new phase.
The story of D&D is definitely still being written, that's for sure.
One roll of the dice at a time.
Indeed. Keep rolling those 20s.
We hope this deep dive into the timeline of D&D editions was insightful and maybe sparked some memories or curiosity. Please feel free to share your own thoughts in the comments, your favorite editions, your earliest D&D memories, or what you think about the future direction. We genuinely love to hear them.